Welcome back to the Side Chat Podcast. Today I have Bismarck and Cobey will be with me.
Hello.
Hola.
And we will be discussing the ME262. This will be a two-part series. You can expect to hear about basically the years of 1938 to early 1944. And the second part will be talking about the frontline use and the combat of the ME262 and the actual production. This is all going to be about development, design, and production.
So in 1938, you have the first turbines being conceptualized and produced or built in Germany by BMW and Junkers. And out of that comes the general idea of creating a fighter or a plane that is able to use these and obviously make the next step forward in aircraft production and design. So in January 1939, you have the project by Messerschmitt called P65. Later it is also redesignated as P1065. So that is essentially where the ME262 is born. It's a very rough draft initially.
I have the contract information if you want to hear it real quick for
sure,
that aircraft. They wanted two aircraft, a high-speed pursuit, and a target defense aircraft. The power plant was to use one turbojet engine. At that time, that was completely unspecified. The high-speed fighter was going to have two MG-17 machine guns, 1,000 rounds per gun, one MG-151 20mm cannon with 150 rounds. The interceptor would have half that ammo to save weight. The airframe was to be completely made out of metal construction, and the design requirement said to make it as cheap as possible.
Yeah, so that's essentially what they wanted, and the biggest change from what we just heard is probably the armament from that, and that the fact that it used two engines in the end. What is important to know at this point is that they're still not sure what they're actually going to be producing. They don't even know what engine they're going to be using. They don't know what the performance of the engine is going to be. As I said, they have the BMW engine lined up. Although BMW quickly realizes that their first engine design isn't really up to snuff, and they start building the P3303, complicated name as always. And you also have the Jumo 004 that starts being put into production. Now in January 1940, the Air Ministry demands 20 prototypes. That is later then cut down again, and then after that it is once again extended to 20 prototypes. And you also quickly, and this is actually something that struck me when I looked into the ME262, is you have very quick, very early on, you have ideas of up-arming the 262 quite significantly. So already in March 1940, they're thinking of mounting the Mk108, which at that point was not yet considered for all the other planes, for example, the Bf109, which would later, of course, use it. But that is quite interesting because the Germans at that point actually felt that their armament was sufficient to get the job done.
Early on, they were talking about putting 6 Mk108s in the nose of that thing.
Yeah, there's all kinds of ideas, like there's 6, then there's 4, then there's 3, then they wanted to go back to the MG 151, not even the Dash 20, just the 151. It's really up in the air. They don't know what they're actually going to do at this point.
They did not know the size of the engine that they were going to get. They didn't know the weight of the engine that they were going to get. They didn't know the output that the engine was going to provide. So the team at Messerschmitt just kind of stood there like, what the hell are we making? We have no... How do you design an aircraft without knowing anything about the power plant on it?
You don't. You have to wait until you get what you get, and then you design around it.
So there's probably, I'd say, close to maybe 100-something wing designs for this aircraft. Probably about 25 different landing gear designs. And then you have engines in all kinds of different placements. When I say wing design, they're straight wing. They originally started with the 109 or the 110 wing on the ME262. And then you had every angle you can imagine. They hand-drawn, and Messerschmitt did quite a few of these drawings himself. They had landing gear in bizarre places. They actually had them on the bottom of the engines, where the landing gear will be out in front of the turbine, which is really odd looking. You had tail dragger configurations, nose gear configurations, you name it. Another thing they struggled with was where they actually put the engine on the wing. As we note today, the ME262 had the engines underslung. They originally wanted to put them kind of in the middle of the wing, like you see in most airplanes. The big reason they didn't do that was because of cost. It was better to attach them underneath the wing also for maintenance, because the Jumos required a lot of downtime, and it made it much easier for the crews to access.
Yeah, that's pretty much what they decided on end of 1940, that they would put those engines under the wing.
What would you say? Maybe 250 total designs of the ME-262 on paper before they even got the first prototype built?
Yeah, there's a gazillion. But that shows that they were dealing with new tech and they really didn't know what to do at first.
So construction of the first ME-262 prototype started in February of 1941. The first flight of the aircraft was in April 18, 1941, and that was only powered by a Jumo, the engine of the BF-109, the Jumo 210G. Thank you. There was just a single propeller engine in the nose of the aircraft. That was kept in there later for safety reasons when they actually flew the aircraft with the turbine engines. So the prop engine was to basically be a backup in case they had failure. We'll talk about that later. The original test pilot for the 262 was primarily Fritz Wendel. He was I'd say, extraordinarily good pilot, and he was, I think you find, one of the more committed individuals to his job. Was it about 2 or 3 days before that Bismarck? He was flying the 109T.
Yeah.
Which is the 109 carrier version. The aircraft was reported to have a flutter in the wings. He was getting it up to speeds. The wing started to shake, and then the wing disappeared completely. Attempted to bail out of the aircraft. On the way down, he realized his parachute was missing, and he looked down, and basically only the straps around his legs were left. It completely came free of his shoulders. He had to reattach his parachute. He opened the parachute too low to the ground, and I think he...
Can't remember what bones he didn't break anything, but he was in hospital, let's say.
The first thing that was out of his mouth was, "I still want to fly a 262. I'm ready to go whenever it is." So he almost dies and then wants to fly the most unproven concept of an aircraft like 2 or 3 days later.
Good for him.
It should also be mentioned that with that piston engine, the Jumo 210G, that's an engine that produces around about 730 horsepower, which was not a lot for the plane itself. So they just flew it. They saw that it kind of worked. But they realized that until they can install those real engines, the ones the 262 is supposed to have, either the BMWs or the Jumos, they can't test anything with the aircraft, whether it's diving, climbing, or how it's going to perform in any kind of way. So the V1 with the engines, the first one they flew was in March 1942. That was the BMW engines. And they were delivered just a couple of days earlier. They were installed, and it didn't go all that well. As soon as the plane took off, the engines kind of failed. Luckily, they did have the backup engine, the Jumo that we talked about, and Fritz Wendel was able to save the aircraft that way, and himself probably. Then in July 1942, just a couple of months later, the Jumos get delivered. And at this point, of course, everybody is a little bit concerned whether the Jumos are going to fail just like the BMWs. The BMW company is now trying to reevaluate their engine, but they realize that in the conceptual form that they have it right now, it's not going to work. But the Jumos do work, and they're installed on the V3, and the plane for the first time there essentially flies with a jet engine, only a jet engine.
There was a little issue though, V3. It had a tail dragger landing gear, no nose gear landing gear. The aircraft had 2 wheels underneath the wings and then 1 on the tail, so it sat back. Wendell found out that...
Yeah, you had to get about 180 kilometers an hour. And Wendell, in fact, he punched the brakes at that speed just for a split second, and that caused the tail to go up. And at that point, he had enough lift on his wings. Maybe Cobey can go into this more. But essentially, for example, for a piston engine, the prop kind of makes this helix around the aircraft, and that adds, I think, lift to the wings. And as the engines obviously were now underslung on the wings didn't have that lift. So in the configuration that they had at that point, taking off was quite a challenge.
Yep, that's pretty much exactly right. Yeah, you are correct.
Just a little bit later, Beauvais, the second pilot to fly the ME-262, shows up. Wendell tells him that at a certain point, you're going to have to hit the brakes, get the tail flying, and then you take off. When Beauvais started up for the first time and took off, or tried to take off, he went past Wendell, and nothing happened. And Wendell just heard a crash, basically, at the end of the runway. They all ran over to find Beauvais in a cornfield, and they went through about, 10-15 rows, you say?
Oh yeah, he went far.
Yeah, and Beauvais gets out and said, "This is the first farm to ever be harvested by turbine power."
Yes.
I guess, German humor a little bit there.
That is the definition of German humor, yeah. Quickly want to backtrack as well. Also in August 1942, the Germans now have a pretty good idea, or at least a solid idea of what they can do with the 262. And they start ordering essentially 10 more prototypes, V11 to V20. And in those, they actually have already a pretty solid idea of what they want. Obviously, they want a front wheel because they've realized the tail wheel is not going to cut it. So next to the tricycle landing gear, they obviously wanted a pressurized cabin at that point. They started thinking about what kind of radios they're going to mount. And they also have a more solid idea, let's say, about the armament, thinking maybe to use an MK-103 and a couple of MG-151s. They also are thinking about mounting some weapons in the wings, since there is theoretically still space for that. They also, of course, want to place a little bit of armor for the pilot and for the fuel tanks. And then the interesting thing at this point is they're considering an air brake.
An air brake, like a speed brake?
Yeah.
At this point in development, they weren't in a huge hurry to put the 262 into production because Germany saw this as more of a post-war project, something that they would roll out after they were victorious. And their primary fear for doing this was that they did not want the aircraft and the technology to end up either in Russia's hands or the British or the Americans or the French or whatever. They did not want this technology to get out of German hands, so they saw it more as a long-term play. That changed on December 10, 1942, just a couple months later, when the war wasn't going so well for the Germans. There was an order put out for ME-163s, ME-262s, HE-210s, ME-328s, and AR-234s. And so basically all this stuff that they were designing kind of on the back burner became front and center.
Yeah, it's at this point that Milch essentially says that by 1944 we want to have about 20 of these ME-262s in production per month, or finished per month, which is not a whole lot if you think about it now, but for then they considered it a lot. And the ME-262 does become a priority, which it had not been until that point. Yeah, and the interesting part, of course, here is also that the Air Ministry changes their stance on what fighters are supposed to be able to do and what not. And in February 1943, they essentially say that any kind of fighter aircraft that is produced from now on, for it to be even considered by us, it needs to be able to carry bombs. Just, it's not actually something that is a big change, I would say, because the technology, the pylons and so on, that's readily available. You just have to fit those to your aircraft, and you can make a fighter bomber out of a fighter. Something that pretty much every nation did, and did rather quickly, even with planes that weren't designed as a fighter bomber. But it does go to show that very early on, before that crucial meeting that we're going to talk about, they did consider putting up bombs, because when that order came out just a month later, Messerschmitt's internal project description includes the option of a fighter bombing capability, for the ME-262, either with a 500 kilogram bomb, or two 220s, or two 250s, or even a torpedo. They actually thought about mounting a torpedo to this thing.
Cobey has a quick story of a eyewitness account of his grandfather, if you want to share that real quickly.
So most of you guys know my grandfather was a flight engineer on B-24s and B-17s and some other airplanes during the war. He was regular Army. He was he joined the Army Air Corps in '39, so he was regular Army before the war even started. So he was telling me a story before he died. He was cruising along. They were going to France on a bombing mission, and they were cruising along, and he saw some airplanes off in the distance, and they got closer, and they're P-38s, and he's like, "Oh, sweet, escort." So they escorted him for a while. He looked and saw one of them had the left engine feathered, which was not really unusual back then. The P-38s were actually designed to cruise on one engine once they got up to altitude, especially when they're with the slow bombers. They could really throttle back and shut down an engine and conserve a lot of gas. So they were flying along. He didn't really think of it. He looked again, and he saw that the right engine was feathered as well. He's like, "What the heck?" So he got to look closer and noticed that there was something strapped underneath the bottom of the airplane, and it was some sort of jet engine, and they were flying. There were 4 airplanes. They were flying along. One engine was one airplane had this thing strapped to the bottom of it. They were flying along and disappeared. He tried to take a picture of it, and I don't have a picture, of course, because back in the 60s, my grandparents' house burned down and lost all their pictures, but he swears to God that he saw the airplane flying with both engines feathered and the jet engine strapped to the bottom of the airplane.
What year was this?
This was late 43, like October, November 43.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would honestly say, in all truthfulness, I think the Allies were a bit more advanced in terms of technology. The only problem is that we were concentrating more on materials, on advanced materials, and on steam turbines for ships than we were jet turbines for airplanes.
Right, and you want to talk real quickly about what's the difference between axial flow, which is what the GMO is, versus centrifugal, which was what we were primarily focused on?
There's two types of jet engine types. There's centrifugal flow, and then there's axial flow, or centrifugal flow, sorry, and axial flow. Centrifugal flow has an impeller. Basically, you think of like a water pump, like a pump to pump out a lake. Water comes in, it gets compressed in a wheel, and then shot out the other end. Well, the same thing happens with air. The fundamental of a jet engine is that air comes in, air gets compressed, and then it gets heated from the compression. It gets mixed with fuel and ignited, and then it gets sent out the back end. That's basically a jet engine. So there's two types. There's the centrifugal or centrifugal compressor, which is just like a water pump, and there's also axial flow, which means that the air comes straight in, and there are different sections of compressors. So one set of blades compresses it a little bit, and then another set behind it compresses it more and more and more and more and more and more and more. Axial flow, which is what 95% of all current turbine engines are built like, with a couple of exceptions. It's much more efficient. You can compress much more air. It's just better all around. The problem with the other type is that you're limited to the size of the impeller and the size of the housing that it can ride in, because the air can only go so far. So the British engine, the Whittle engine, was a centrifugal compressor, and the Germans were axial flow compressor.
Yeah, the Germans actually did have a centrifugal one in the Heinkel 280, but that project got scrapped, and the Heinkel engines, the Heinkel S8A, didn't essentially get used after that anymore. So they could have potentially had one of those engines as well, which, like Cobey says, are better, but yeah, they didn't with the 262.
Now getting back to 262, production had a lot of issues in 1943. The primary one was that they had no tooling for it. All of the prototypes at this point were basically hand built. Messerschmitt basically said, we can do something else with the current tooling we have. I'm going to try to describe this. They wanted to take a 109, and it would be called the 109 TL. It would be a 109 fuselage. It would have a ME-155 wing, the undercarriage from a ME-309, and then it would be powered by two Jumo 004s. Ultimately, it's decided that this would save 0 time. And in January 22nd, 1943, the 262 earned the highest development priority in terms of research, and then shortly after that, it was entered into the highest priority for production.
So also by April 1943, the Luftwaffe actually tests the ME-262 for the first time, and it actually deems it ready, which is interesting to hear. However, at the same time, there is also a test pilot, Willy Ostertag, who actually dies. They don't really know what exactly happened. They think that there has been a problem with the elevator, that the elevator didn't have enough control anymore at high speed during a high-speed dive. So they actually make some adjustments to that, but his real cause of death remains a mystery in a sense. Just a month later, after this, after the Luftwaffe deems it ready, the Air Ministry is essentially given the last real update on the production variants. I say last real update because The Me-262 from now on is known as a fighter and a fighter bomber. The description that Messerschmitt hands over to the Air Ministry, and once again, this is before that fateful meeting with Hitler and the Me-262, and it quite specifically says that the aircraft will be able to carry bombs. Galland also flies the Me-260 at this point, and just like the Luftwaffe before that, he says the Me-262 is ready. He's absolutely stunned by the aircraft. He goes to Milch.
In his words, an angel was pushing the aircraft.
Yes. And you can't really get higher praise than that. And Milch, who essentially trusted Galland's verdict at that point, puts an order out for 100 Me-262. Not that order actually gets anywhere beyond paper.
There's a little issue of that order called Messerschmitt. He preferred his Me-209 over the 262. And he kind of did everything he could in terms of personnel and business-wise, Me-209 as the highest priority for his company, and the 262 was kind of a secondary. I can't quite understand this. It's almost like he was purposely trying to trip up the aircraft.
I think it makes sense from a business standpoint, because then he can get an order for the Me-209, and then later on, a couple of years later, once jet planes become important, then he can get the order for the Me-262. So he was losing out on one order, essentially. You might make that argument. I don't know if that's true, but that's maybe an explanation of what he was trying to think.
Milk saw that the 209 was inferior to the 190 Dora. And he knew that there was no reason to have the 209. The 262 was going to be the superior aircraft.
Yeah, and this is actually even at a time when the Me-262 still has no front wheel. That actually only gets used or tested a month after Galland flew the 262. So they still don't have the gear fixed, but still a lot of people say we need to get this thing into production we need to get this thing into production ASAP.
So May 31, 1943, Göring suspends all Me-209 production in favor of the Me-262. On June 21st, Milk put out another order that said all production on the 209 should be abandoned. All labor then should be transferred to the Me-262 project. He wanted 100 aircraft by the end of 1943. So that's on June 21st. On June 27, Messerschmitt was invited to a meeting with Hitler with some other individuals from the aviation industry. And there, Messerschmitt said, "Hey, my 209 got canceled, and I think it's a bad idea. The 262 is going to use up far more fuel than the 209 ever will. You should let me build the 209 over the 262. Hitler's like, "That's a great idea. I'm going to undo all the orders that Milk and Göring put out before that." What Messerschmitt didn't tell Hitler was that they used two completely different type of fuels. What's the difference between what the 109 was running and what the 262 is running in terms of aviation fuel?
Their piston engines, aviation piston engines, run on this stuff called avgas, or aviation fuel, aviation gasoline. It's an extremely, extremely refined version of gasoline for your car. It's much better stuff. So it takes a lot of work and a lot of resources to make it. Jet engines, on the other hand, can pretty much run on anything that's viscous. So it can run on oil, it can run on all sorts of stuff. Jet fuel today is basically just kerosene, which is basically more refined diesel fuel, and jet engines can run on diesel fuel as well. So it's much easier to produce kerosene. It's much cheaper to produce kerosene. You can make it a lot faster than you can aviation gasoline. Having said that, jet engines can run on avgas just fine. No problems at all.
I don't think that Juma would have been back then. That might have blown up.
Yeah, I probably would have. Yeah, I mean, the problem with the early engines, especially the German engines, was their lack of materials. You know, jet engines operate in extremely hot environments. You know, the inner core inside there, where the combustion actually happens, especially in a turbojet, which is a straight jet engine, meaning air in, air out. There is no bypass at all. Can reach well over 2,000 degrees centigrade, and you need special materials and special metals to handle that heat, and it just wasn't really available to them back then.
Yeah, the Jumo actually went through a couple of redesigns. So you had the Jumo 04A, which they had to redesign into the B, since it was just guzzling up too much fuel. And then with the B, at the same time, even though they made it more fuel efficient, they had to use less scarce resources. And at that point, you're starting to get into problems when it comes to the longevity of the actual engine. It's not too complicated to produce anymore. They can actually get quite a number of the engines out there, which obviously then once it becomes operational, these engines can be changed out rather quickly. But the longevity of the engine is just not what it would be like on a piston engine.
So that delayed production for several months. We're going to go back to the prototypes of the ME262 because a lot of interesting stuff happened during this time, this kind of window here, in mid to late 1943. V4 failed to take off due to warm weather, and the aircraft didn't provide enough lift, and it crashed. And V5 in August, when it was landing, the tire bursted on landing, and they lost that aircraft, or it was heavily damaged. And so when they lost those two aircraft, that left them with V1 and V3. So V4 was about 60% damaged, and they decided to do some high-speed testing with it. They got an ME232, that big beast, right? They suspended the 262 underneath one wing, and then about 1,000 pounds of concrete bombs on the other wing.
As a counterbalance?
They got the aircraft up into the air. They were both released with explosive bolts. The aircraft dropped. It hits, about 541 miles per hour, 870 km/h. And then it kind of never slowed down. It was supposed to be recovered by parachutes.
Yeah.
The parachutes failed, and it hit the ground somewhere around 500 mph. And that was the end of ME262 V4.
Did it bury itself into the ground?
Yeah, there was not much left, probably. They don't even, we're not even sure if it's the V4. Everybody assumes that it's the V4, but there's... Yeah, it would make sense that it's the V4, but nobody actually completely is sure if it was, but... That's how little there was left.
Wow.
After that test, they wanted to do this again. They needed high-speed test data. This is the problem. If they had next to no information on how an aircraft acts above 500 mph. And the wind tunnels in Germany were not exactly built for this type of testing either at that point.
Yeah, it's probably worth mentioning that around the same time that the V4 buries itself into the ground, the last kind of conceptualized ideas are proposed. And Germans essentially, or Messerschmitt gives to the air ministry a collection of 8 ideas. 2 of them being recon versions of the 262, 3 of them being fighters, 1 trainer, and then this is also interesting to know, 2 of them armed with bombs. And once again, this is before that meeting with Hitler.
Was there a night fighter version there yet, or was that
no?
Would that come later?
That came later.
Okay.
They don't have a night fighter version just yet. With the same time as well, they finally got the hydraulic front wheel to work. With the V5, the one that Bo mentioned and that crashed, you had a fixed front wheel that gave away during landing. Now you have a hydraulic front wheel, which is obviously a lot better. It's not going to be into production without that. And also the Jumo 004B is installed in the V6, and it runs like a charm. Also, before that, maybe something we kind of forgot to mention is they actually thought about maybe adding some rocket boost to the aircraft, either for quick takeoff or in kind of emergency that the pilot can get out fast. But essentially, they realized that it's probably going to be too dangerous strapping 2 rockets under the engines for emergency purposes.
September 7, 1943, there was a second meeting between Messerschmitt and Hitler that talked about the 262. I'm sure they met many times before this, and this is where the seed got planted in Hitler's head that he had a new super bomber. Messerschmitt told Hitler that the 262 could be used as a fast bomber and could strike the British Isles. Hitler loved that idea. Little seed planted in Hitler's head that blossomed into a nightmare. On November 26, they wanted to have a demonstration of all of the latest aircraft for Hitler's benefit. The Germans were taking pretty bad losses at that point, and they were losing territories, and they wanted to make the Führer feel better. So they put the Fritz bomb on display. They had the ME-163. I believe there was a 162 there. All kinds of goodies, right? Me-262 V1 and V6 were there on display. There was also the Arado 234 was there. Actually kind of cool little air show. Not gonna lie. And when Hitler and the group walked up to the 262, so you had Galland, Göring, Messerschmitt, Hitler, and probably probably about 25 people from the staff behind them. Hitler walked up to 262 and he said, "I'm not interested in this aircraft as a fighter, but can it carry bombs?" Which is kind of weird because we already know that he demanded that all fighters carry bombs, and that Messerschmitt, 2 months before, said that the 262 could be a bomber. So once again, you kind of have this conflicting data. But from that point forward, Messerschmitt might have claimed, might have claimed, that yes, it could carry up to 1,000 kilograms of bombs, which was in the, I guess you call the original proposal, right? Because like they thought it could carry 1,000 kilograms of bombs back in 1941, 1942.
Yeah, they conceptualized it first with a 500, but they theoretically they were sure that they could either get a 1,000 kilogram bomb on there or 2 500s.
So that number wasn't just pulled out thin air. This was something that, they thought was possible. And then Hitler might have replied, we'll go with that terminology, "At last, this is the aircraft I've been demanding for years. Here it is, but nobody has recognized it. I order this aircraft to be built as a bomber." Now, I've seen in Galland's book, he has a different story of what was said there. Messerschmitt, I think in 2 or 3 different times, has been quoted saying different things here.
Or Göring.
And then you have all the staffers behind him that have different accounts of what happened there. So, who knows what the real story is here?
Well, I think, when Galland probably gives the most diplomatic answer without trying to step on anybody's toes, when he just said that Messerschmitt answered truthfully that it could carry bombs, which is true. Any aircraft can essentially carry bombs. Something that you have to keep in mind when you talk about this moment is that Messerschmitt had already, or the Messerschmitt company at least, and Messerschmitt himself, of course, as well, he was a businessman, they knew that a new fighter has to be able to carry bombs, and they made precautions that the Me-262 could be shown to have been developed with that in mind. So from a business standpoint, it makes absolutely sense that Messerschmitt was already looking into getting the 262 armed with bombs. And this is not something that just suddenly appeared out of thin air from Hitler's mind. Although there is quite a few statements from the people around it that all say that they realized just at that moment, and apparently there was an awkward silence that followed this statement from Hitler, with all of them realizing, okay, that this aircraft is done for. It's not going to be used for what it should be used. But yeah, there's so many accounts from what happened at that time, and I think there's truth probably in all of them. It really depends. Did Messerschmitt just answer truthfully to say the truth, as he was essentially obliged to do? Or was it something he was looking forward to? That may be a discussion you can have on maybe perhaps the guilt, if you want to call it like that, he perhaps shares with the Me-262 being used as a bomber. But it would probably have been used anyway as a bomber, because that idea that Hitler had wouldn't have been stopped just by Messerschmitt saying no.
The big obsession with the bomber didn't just come out of Hitler's whatever need or desire, whatever you want to call it. Germany did not have a good heavy bomber at this point. I guess you call it the main frontline bombers you had was the FW-200, which there wasn't that many of. The HE-111s, the Ju-88s, the Dorniers, all of them were pretty much out of date by 1943, 1944, 1945.
They didn't have very many. They didn't really have strategic bombing at all. Their biggest strategic bomber was the Heinkel 177, which was satisfactory at best.
And the 262 might have been the aircraft to fill that gap in their missing arsenal. So there was a reason they needed a aircraft to be a bomber, and that was the 262 might have been the aircraft to do that. Hitler then, at a later meeting, said that the fast bomber was to have all onboard weaponry removed. So no cannons, no machine guns, so it could carry more bombs. He claimed that the jet would be fast enough that it would never need any defense. He wanted the aircraft to fly at great heights and in straight lines. A 262 at best could carry 500 kilograms and maybe have a primitive bomb sight. So for fun, let's have a quick conversation of Me-262 bomber versus the thousands of B-17s, B-24s, Lancasters, and every other thing flying over Germany at this point. How many 262s carrying 500 kilogram bombs would it take to overcome what the 8th Air Force was doing to Germany?
I have the answer to that. 11 billion.
It made more sense as this thing to be a fighter that could theoretically engage 1 to 4 bombers every flight versus an aircraft that would maybe have the range to drop a 250 kilogram to 500 kilogram bomb.
Especially at this point in time. If this was in 1941, I could still understand them thinking about this. But yeah, at this point in time, it makes absolutely no sense. It's just after that Hitler essentially comes up with this idea of the Blitzbomber, the Schnellbomber, or whatever you want to call it, that the 262 is actually ready, or more or less ready for production, because finally the Jumo 004 B1s are being delivered in great number, essentially, and the production can now start. Now, there's still some questions about the actual armament. Like Bo said, we weren't still sure if that plane is going to be a bomber or a fighter, but they finally decide on 4 Mk108s, and by April 1944, the V-10 is built, and that plane is just that plane is designed to be a fighter bomber. So they're starting to make trials with that. Things start going really, really quickly. Just a month later, Hitler on a meeting once again screams at everybody that he wants the Blitzbomber.
Can I tell the story?
Yeah, sure.
This is a really good story. I really like this story. So basically, late May of 1944, Hitler was being read all of the future aircraft production numbers. And when they were mentioning the fighter numbers, the 262 was read underneath the fighter category. And he lost it. Interrupted the person who was reading off the list and said, "I thought the 262 was becoming a bomber." Milk replied, "All aircraft were completed as fighters thus far. The aircraft would not be able to become a bomber without extensive modifications." Hitler then asked for the armament and armor of the aircraft. He added those up and said, "Remove those, and that will save you 500 kilograms, and put a 250 kilogram bomb on it." Galland and Milk attempted to protest against this. A further torrent of abuse and cussing was yelled out from Hitler. And then Milk then responded, "Even the smallest child can see this is a fighter, not a bomber." Hitler then turned his back to Milk the rest of the meeting and did not acknowledge his existence.
Yeah.
On May 29th, 1944, Göring called a huge meeting of anybody that might have been involved in the 262. Messerschmitt, Galland, everybody was kind of brought there. The 262's jurisdiction was to be transferred over to the General of the Bombing Forces.
Yeah, it's also worth mentioning that at this point, the 262 has actually undergone the first trials as a fighter bomber. They dropped a 250 kilogram bomb, just a single one, successfully. Then they dropped a 500 kilogram bomb. So now those people that want it as a bomber have proof that it is capable of doing so, and they always go back to these trials and say, "See, it can actually be done."
But hold on, real quickly. But when you say drop a bomb, most people are going to think it dive bombed. The 262 in no way could dive bomb without blowing itself to pieces.
I mean, they had that early concept that I mentioned with an air brake that was in mind with dive bombing capability, but they never installed it because they realized it's going to be too complicated, essentially.
So when it dropped the bomb, it was 100% blind loft bombing.
Yes.
Completely inaccurate, completely ineffective. They could be trying to hit something and miss up to miles away. So after that was established, the aircraft was also now to be called Super Speed Bomber. It was no longer to be referred to as fighter or fighter bomber. Super Speed Bomber. And then Göring shared the belief that the Me-262 would be ready to bomb any invading forces on the beaches and the ships. This was on May 29, 1944. D-Day was just about a week later. So I don't think they had enough time to, get Göring's plan into action.
So ironically also with D-Day, the day that D-Day happened is the day that the contract or the construction order for the Me-262A1 is being signed. And that's of course the one that is supposed to be able to carry a couple of bombs. Now with it being signed, of course, production ramps up, and by June and July 1944, you have the first production runs. These are actually A2As. And the Erste Gruppe Kampfgeschwader 51, that's KG-51, those are bomber pilots, by the way, are being trained in the use of the aircraft as a bomber in September of that year. And the early combat that they had And next to these guys, you already had a couple of Erprobungskommando, like trial squadrons that tried to see what they can make work with those aircraft. But with the combat operations that they had in France early on, during the operation of the Me-262 as a bomber or fighter bomber, they're not very promising. They're losing a lot of 262s in this way, also because they can't cover them with escort fighters.
So this was part 1, and as you can see, Bismarck's already talking about kind of how part 2 is going to proceed. Talking about the squadrons, we'll be talking about production models, we'll be talking about all the stuff that happened basically from late 1944 till the end of the war.
It's a beautiful aircraft, and a great aircraft.
It is a really beautiful airplane. I totally agree with that.
Thank you to everybody who sent in Me-262 replays for the background footage. I greatly appreciate the help. And thank you so much to Bismarck and Cobey being here. Please check out Bismarck's channel. I'll put a link of that in the description. He's putting up a lot of great content about World War II on the Eastern Front, and on recently been doing stuff on the Pacific, which I really like. So
thank you very much.
If you like this type of content, Bismarck is definitely a channel that you should be subscribed to. We'll do our best to get part 2 out a little bit faster. I'm sorry part 1 took this long. We had a bunch of stuff happen in our real lives that kind of, every time Bismarck and I tried to get a date, it just kind of, something happened and it kind of got pushed back. So I apologize. Part 2, we will do our best to get it out much sooner. And we will see you then. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.